No clapping. We don't need any of that clapping. Hey, I want to check. There's a scheduling change. I want to make sure that nobody is here for the fundraiser for Kid Rock's U.S. Senate run, right? I don't know where it's at, but I just know it's not here. So thanks very much for coming out. We really appreciate it. Look, Ike's lived through it. Lauren's living because of it. Chastity and I have been living it for a year because we've been studying it, and Peter Hammer has a thing or two to say as well. So let me introduce these guys. They've all been involved in the 1967, well, now, here we go. First question. Rebellion, uprising, riot, insurrection, what is it? Just quick, 1, 2, 3, 4. Ike, what is it?
Oh, it's all of those.
You guys.
Put your mic up.
I'm sorry. It's all of those, depending upon who you talk to. But for me, it's a rebellion.
I would say rebellion also.
I'm black, so I say rebellion.
Rebellion it is.
Okay, there you go. All right, so Ike McKinnon was Detroit's deputy mayor. He was former police chief. He's an assistant professor at the University of Detroit. And in 1967, he was one of the few African-American cops on the Detroit police force. It was 40% black in the city at that time, 1967. 5% of the police force was African-American. So he might have a thing or two to say about what was happening in 67 because he was there. Lauren Hood is with Live 6 Alliance Detroit. She's working on community development, primarily in Detroit's McNichols and Livernois corridors. But she's also an expert in diversity training. And the one thing I know about her is last year when I was looking for people to talk about racial issues, somebody said, "You've got to talk to Lauren Hood." I said, "Why?" She said, "She's a voice to be heard." And now, having heard her voice a few times, I agree with that. And the other thing I could tell you is we did a taping of the American Black Journal with Detroit Public Television. It'll air this coming Sunday at 9:30. She's on that show, and they're introducing her as the post-67...
I just missed it.
So what is her life after that? We'll probably ask her that too. Chastity Pratt Dawson is my colleague with the Detroit Journalism Cooperative and with Bridge Magazine. She works there, also co-author of the book, The Intersection, which I'll tell you about in just a little bit. And she also has been working on, for more than a year now, what happened after 67 and why. And then finally, Peter Hammer is a professor at Wayne State University Law School and the director of the Damon J. Keith Center for Civil Rights. And Peter, I told you I was going to ask you this. Who is Damon J. Keith?
Yeah. Most people I hear already know the answer to that. But Judge Keith, July 4th, Independence Day, celebrated his 95th birthday, so he's 95 years young. I would say the most respected citizen in the city of Detroit, one of the greatest jurists that our country has ever produced in terms of civil liberties and civil rights. And I'm just trying to think what Judge Keith was doing in 67. He was co-chair of the Michigan Civil Rights Commission. He was a practicing attorney, and he had just recently been nominated by Lyndon Baines Johnson to a federal district court position.
Wow.
So, prestigious panel. I'm going to tell you about this book real quickly. This was put together by the Detroit Journalism Cooperative last year. Last year, we decided to spend a year looking at a document that had to do with the 1967 rebellion, uprising, insurrection. After this, this wasn't the only one. Detroit wasn't the only city. There were dozens of cities across the nation in 67 that had civil disturbances. And all the white folks were going, why did that happen? And President Lyndon Baines Johnson appointed a commission to find out why that happened. It ended up being called the Kerner Commission after the chair of the commission, a guy named Otto Kerner, a former governor of Illinois. And they put out in 1968, early in 1968, quick turnaround, their reasons. And they went around to all the cities where there had been civil disturbances. They asked the people, what was the cause of this? What is your complaint? What is your grievance? And then they came back and said, okay, here are all the grievances, and here's the cause. White attitudes toward black people. And all the white people got just as quiet as this room right now. I mean, President Johnson was thinking, why did I put these guys on this commission? He kind of shelved that. There's a great conversation on phone because Johnson taped everything between him and the mayor at the time, Daley. And he's basically telling him, if I knew they were going to do this, you know, and it was just horrible. So he never really embraced it. He never really endorsed it. And then we voted in a law and order president, and the Kerner Commission report went away. So we revived it, basically. We said, what are these grievances? And they were about cops. They were about housing. They were about poverty. They were about jobs. They were about education. They were about a fair number of things, 12 different things. And so Chastity and I and our colleagues spent the whole year saying, okay, what was it like in '67 and what is it like today in Detroit? And here's what we found out. Police relationships are better. Everything else that we studied in Detroit is actually worse now than it was in 1967 for black people in Detroit. For African Americans in Detroit, it's worse. There was a conclusion by the Kerner report that said, we are building two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. An acquaintance of mine, a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, Heather Ann Thompson, said, yeah, we've done that. Now what are we going to do about it? And she's hopeful that this generation is going to do something about it. Well, let's go back to '67. I want to start with Ike. He was there. Actually, I want to go earlier than '67 because we're talking about police tensions leading to the beginning of the rebellion. And you were a kid, your family had moved to Detroit, and you were like 14 years old, and you got an introduction to the police force. Could you tell us about that?
I can, and actually the introduction had come before that because my family moved to Detroit in 1953. And I'm sorry, I'm 39 years old. How can I be? You know? But my introduction was, you're always astute to things that are going on, but I never saw any people of color as the police officers drove by my house. But I would see these cars that was called the Big Four. There were four very large white officers who would jump out of the car on the corner by my house, and they would grab these young black men, throw them up against the car, and beat them up. And they would have their machine gun, a rifle, and probably a shotgun. And they would beat these kids with these things. Then they would take off. I mean, the name calling. And so I always thought, I mean, my God, this is crazy as a young boy. Why is this happening? And so my true introduction was in 1957 when I had graduated from junior high, and it was my first day of high school at Cass Tech. And at that time, it was a half day of school. And I went back to Garfield to say thank you to Mr. Hughes, who was a teacher, who I'm still in contact with today. He's 90-some years old, but I'm still in contact with him. I was leaving the school, and as I walked across the street, the Big Four grabbed me. They threw me up against the car, the name calling, and they proceeded to beat me between my neck and my belt. And it's unbelievable unless you've gone through something like this, and I hope you haven't, but the anger that I saw on these officers' faces, and the name calling, and I mean, they just beat the hell out of me. And as I said, sir, and it made it even worse in terms of the beating. And I remember specifically as I looked out beyond these officers at the crowd, and it's all black people, and I wondered why they wouldn't do anything. Then as I thought about this later on, I said, hell, if they had interfered or interceded, something would happen to them. And so as they finished beating me up, they said, get your black ass out of here. So I ran home that September night, 1957. I did not tell my parents.
You were 14.
I was 14. I didn't tell my parents because I knew that if I told my parents, my mother in particular, would go up to the precinct and probably get locked up or go to jail. And my father the same way. So I kept this hidden. But I made a decision that evening I was going to become a Detroit police officer. And people said, why the hell do you want to become a cop? Because I said, I want to make sure those kinds of things don't happen, not only to me, but to other people. And in 1965, I joined the Detroit Police Department. So my introduction was that horrible beating that I got from the Detroit Police Department by these horrible, horrible, racist, vile, profane officers.
Now, before we get to July 23rd, the beginning of this, I want to ask you one other question. After you're a cop, you walk into a restaurant and you actually get to see one of those guys face to face. What happened?
God, I thought you'd forgotten that one. Well, I was, it was early, 1967. And it used, oh God, I can't think of the name of the restaurant, but it's on Woodward Avenue across from the Bonsell Theater. And so my partner, he drank coffee. I never drank coffee, drank orange juice. So we said, let's go get this. We had the patrol car. So we walked in, and my partner, who's white, he said, man, that's Rotation Slim. That was the name of the guy who was notorious in the black community for kicking people's asses, you know. And so I said, what? He said, that's Rotation Slim. And I looked and I saw this guy. And I must tell you that as I saw him, I could feel and hear the steam coming out of my ears. Because I really wanted to kill his ass, you know. And so I hope this is okay for the radio. Anyway, so I made a beeline towards him. Beep. Now, I had been trained. I mean, I was a black belt in karate and all those other kinds of things, and I was going to kick his ass. But I walked back to him. He's sitting there drinking a cup of coffee by himself, and he was in plain clothes, and he's drinking his coffee. And I walked up and I said, "Rotation Slim." He said, "Yes, officer." And it just threw me off, because in 1957, the vile, profane names he had called me, you know, it just took away from all that stuff that he had done. And I said, "Rotation Slim." And he said, "Yes, officer," again. And I said, "In 1957, you did something to me that changed my life." And he said, "What did I do, officer?" And I looked at this guy, and his hand was shaking, because he had done so many bad things to so many people, he didn't know what the hell I was there for. And I looked at him, and instead of kicking his ass, I said, "You wouldn't remember this, but I'm not going to tell you, but I want to thank you." And people say, "Wait a minute, you're thanking this guy for kicking your ass?" I said, "No, I'm thanking him because he set me on a path of something that he never thought would ever happen." And I never envisioned the things that I've accomplished, but every time something happened, whether it's graduating from the police academy, graduating from Michigan State with a PhD, graduating from the FBI Academy, Secret Service, becoming deputy mayor, becoming chief of police, he set me on that path. And I wanted to say, "Go screw yourself," but I didn't. I said, "Thank you." And I walked away from him. Now, I must admit, at that time, I mean, I was steaming. But people don't realize what they do to people in terms of those kinds of things. So that was when I met Rotation Slim, the real time.
Ike's got more stories. We'll get to him a little later, but I want to introduce...
But that was great, because those guys were known throughout the hood.
Yeah.
Everybody who was black knew those guys.
Everybody. It's interesting, when I tell that story to a group of people, a young white man, he told me, he said, "He kicked my ass too." You know, so I'm very seriously, and I mean, this happened to more people, and they've told me that he was an equal opportunity ass kicker. I mean, that's how bad this guy was. And so you think about how bad some of these guys were, you know.
So, Lauren, when I was watching you being taped for the American Black Journal by TPTV, Stephen Henderson asked you a question. I'm going to ask the same, because I don't mind stealing from a Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist. What is the lesson that those folks who were born after '67 have taken from that event?
The lesson? I think there are many. I think the overwhelming lesson would be it's like any other kind of illness. If you don't address it, it doesn't go away. It just gets worse. So we need to not be afraid to talk about it. And I'm really glad that this 50th anniversary gives us all these safe places to have this conversation. But you need to have the conversations at home. Like, you need to have the uncomfortable conversations with your family members, with your colleagues at work. It's got to extend beyond, like, the bar setting where we've convened to talk about this difficult subject. So I appreciate that there's this platform for us to have the conversation, but it's got to happen in the hard places. This is easy.
You told me one time when we were chatting, actually I was interviewing you at the time, and it stuck with me, that I asked you what kind of conversation, how's that start? And she says, we've been talking about, black folk have been talking about race for a long time because
That's
it's a
if
problem.
you are born into the world with this skin, you are having race conversations from a very early age. I think the first time I got called an N-word, like I was on a school bus, I was probably 5. So that shattered my racial innocence. So if you were a person born into this skin, you've been talking about it your whole life. And for like grown adults to say, oh, this conversation's so hard. I'm like, get with it. Like, it's going to be hard. Like, if you want change to happen, you're going to have a really difficult conversation. And people of color have been carrying the torch for far too long. We're ready to pass the baton.
Chastity, you spent all last year looking at that back 67 today. You've got articles in this book. What was the thing that surprised you or caught you off guard?
First off, I got to tell people, this guy is being very humble right now. This book was mostly Lester Graham and Bill McGraw.
No, that book was, I was going to say it's Bill McGraw. Bill McGraw wrote a lot of that.
Who I wish was here because he's way better at this stuff than me. But I think what stood out to me most was the poll that we did. We did a poll on racial attitudes, asking people what they thought, whether race relations were getting any better. What do you think of Black Lives Matter? If your neighborhood turned majority black, would you move? We asked really simple questions toward the beginning, and then they got a little deeper and tougher and harder and more probing, and people, we hope, told the truth. But some of the answers kind of took me off guard because there was a question, real easy question, are race relations better now? And like 50-some% of white people said yes, and like 47% of black people said yes. And I was like, huh? That was very different from the national polls, where people are saying that race relations are getting worse.
It was a unique poll, though, because it wasn't just a blanket poll. We have to tell you that the poll was an equal sampling of places we thought would be mostly black population, places we thought would be mostly white population, and places we thought would be a pretty mixed race town. So that probably skewed it a little.
It was still shocking to me. I just felt like, the whole framing of the book was the Kerner Commission said we're moving towards two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. But we had already been through slavery and Jim Crow and civil rights, and it always has been that way. And some of the questions, I felt like people were being polite, and it was just like, come on. You're not telling the truth. You don't think race relations are getting better. How could you? But then there were, like I said, the question that we asked, if your neighborhood were to turn 50% the other race, would you move? A lot of people said yeah. A lot of white people said yeah. And I was like, now you're being honest. But that definitely was incongruent with the idea that race relations are getting better. If they're getting better, why would you move? So I think that was the most revealing or the part of the book that sticks out to me. And of course, schools are my, soft spot. So I really, Mike and I did the story about segregation in schools, and it always surprises me just how much people are unwilling to send their kids to school with children who don't look like them. We have 152,000 kids in the Detroit area who attend a school other than the one near their home, whether it's a charter school or out-of-district school. And we saw, and we used the data to prove that when black people move into a school, white people move into a different school that's even more white. And the people who do it always say, it has nothing to do with race. Come on, y'all. Come on. We're never going to, conditions are never going to get better if we can't even have the conversation. If we can't even be honest about the conversation. It's 50 years ago. Most of us, didn't have anything to do with any of it. Why can't we talk about it now? That right there is, I think, the gist of what Lauren's saying. Maybe now we can talk about it since we have these, this opportunity with the 50th anniversary. If we can't have a conversation, we're not going to change anything.
Peter Hammer, the first time I heard you speak was about foreclosure. It's at foreclosure seminar. And you and a couple of other of the experts introduced the fact that, hey, race might have something to do with the number of foreclosures in Wayne County. I don't want to pin you down to just foreclosures, but there seems to be a lot of overlooking what might be a racial pattern in that and many other things.
Yeah, it didn't go anywhere. And in many respects, you talk about the Kerner Commission, about two separate societies, separate and unequal and black and white. And what I often tell people is what ratified that was the bankruptcy plan of adjustment. And if you think about not Detroit, but the region, right? You think about separate, in terms of what public services you have available, what educational service you have available, what opportunity is available. We live in a world that John Powell at the House Institute and others call spatial racism, right? And that defines Southeast Michigan. And I often tell people that we are the ground zero. We're the Selma of spatial racism. And if we don't recognize that as a regional issue, it's not just a Detroit issue, it's a regional issue, we don't even begin to talk about it. You talk about the white flight. 50 years ago, we had segregation inside the city of Detroit, right? We had tightly sort of policed neighborhoods where you couldn't go, where violence was used to make sure that people didn't move out of that. And there were a series of other governmental policies on housing that reinforced that. What's happened since then is we now have segregation at a regional level where the entire cities function in that same way. Right? And now you used to have these vigilante groups, these sort of neighborhood improvement associations that would actually act as private violence to enforce those spatial lines. Now what we've done is those same people move to the suburbs and they're the mayor and they're the planning commissions, right? And now they can exercise state authority to safeguard those same safe spaces. And back to your sort of notion of foreclosure, the population in the area has not changed substantially at a regional level in those 50 years, right? What we have done, though, is build tens of thousands of new homes a year, going further and further and further away, which is a downward spiral for any of the old housing stock. Right? So the housing stock in the inner cities, right, in the older cities, cannot be sustained given the broader regional dynamics. And there's a lot of things contributing to the bubble and the fall. I mean, so it got worse, 6 years ago than it might have been. But the seeds of all this is interconnected. And sort of that back to this notion, we have to recognize and have conversations about race, but we also have to see about all these interconnected forces in the schools, in the housing, in the economy that are reinforcing these patterns about who has opportunity and who doesn't.
If I might, Peter, you hit upon a point that I hope that everybody can sit down and think about this. The people who, let me say specifically with the police department, who were in charge or higher ups in police departments and probably other fire departments, city departments, they were people who did not let people of color join the police department. They didn't let them join the fire department. They didn't let them work on certain jobs for the city. And it's so interesting to see that because when they tried to integrate the police department in the late 50s in particular, a lot of these people, they quit. The department moved to other locations, but then they came back. And later on, they became the people in charge of whether it's a police department, the fire department, or other places within the city. That's a frightening thing to think about. I mean, we talk about the systemic racism that's there. As a person who's seen and watched people who were in charge of departments say things that you would not believe, and if I mentioned this before, if you were every day demeaned with a racially derogatory name, every day in my first 3 or 4 years under the Detroit Police Department, a white police officer would say something like that to me, in front of me, or at me. Now, some of these people became executives within the Detroit Police Department. And I remember specifically riding with these guys, and I would say, I'm not going to leave here because I have to be here to make a difference. And they would say something like, and please excuse me for this, they would say, Ike, look at them niggas over there. And I would freeze, and they would say, oh, I didn't mean that. Think about that. I didn't mean that. I said, yes, you did. Yes, you did. No, it slipped out. Yes, you damn right it slipped out, you know? And I got to the point where I would say, which niggers you talking about? And then they would go, oh, he's getting too smart for me. But these are the things that were there and existed, and they became higher-ups on police department and continue to enforce the same kinds of things that existed for years and years and years.
There's an old biblical passage, which I'll paraphrase because I don't remember my Bible that well, but from the heart the mouth speaks. Yeah. So I want to go to 1967. I want to go to the beginning. I'm going to want to go to Ike because he was there.
Are you saying this because I'm old?
Ike's old and he was there. So you were a police officer. You were someone that, was on the front line, and you were on your way home from a shift, and you were stopped.
The first night, it was actually July 24th because the first day was 23rd, and I was called into work that morning at 6 a.m. It's a Sunday morning. So I worked until about 1:30 or 2 the next morning, and I had this. My first car that I owned was a 1965 Mustang convertible. I loved that car. Wish I still had it, but anyway. So I was driving home, came up at Chicago. I lived at 3265 West Boston in an apartment. And I was in my uniform. My hat was on the seat of the car. As I made my left turn into Boston, Chicago Boulevard, these two white police officers pulled me over. And I looked at them and I said, police officer, which that happened so many times when you were stopped by another police officer. And they said, get out of the car. I stepped out of the car, but I left the engine running and the door open. And the older white officer with the brush cut and silver hair, they both had their guns out, but he had his gun pointed at me. And he said, tonight you're gonna die, nigger. And again, I was shot at 8 times, various times in the police department. Never hit, thank God. But it was like time froze for me. And I could see his finger pulling that trigger. And I dove back into my car, and with my right hand, I pushed the accelerator, left hand, I grabbed the steering column. As I drove off, they shot at me. I got to my apartment, I called the sergeant. I said, Sarge, let me tell you what happened. His response was, Ike, there's some assholes out there. That was all that happened. So my question that I asked that evening and that night and countless days was, if these guys were doing this to me, a fellow police officer, what were they doing to the other people in the city of Detroit? Yeah.
Everybody get a drink? Everybody got the beverage of their choice? Because I don't. Okay. Who you have to bribe? I guess it's Steve. All right, Lauren.
You always want me to follow.
Yeah, I know.
Ike
It's a hard act to follow.
Okay,
Right?
sure.
I know.
Sure.
But here's the question I want to ask you, and we've not talked about this before, but it bugs the hell out of me that you hear white folks all the time say, yeah, well, Detroit went to hell after the 67 riots. And because of folks like Thomas Segru and Heather Ann Thompson and many, many others, we know factually that's not true. Do you get that from your friends? Do you hear that?
Well, it's funny when you say we, you probably mean we on the stage that are learned in racial history and city change. Amongst my friends, let me think about that. I guess it varies from person to person, right? So there's no one singular narrative that our generation heard from the other. So my parents in particular didn't talk to me about it much. And I've been trying to peel back the layers and be like, why did we never talk about this? Because it was revealed later. I put 2 and 2 together. One grandmother lived on Claremont and another one lived on Atkinson right around the block. And while it was happening, and I didn't have this conversation with my parents until 5 years ago. So I wonder for them if there was a sense of shame around it. So if the dominant narrative was that black people lost their collective minds, does everybody black want to be associated with that narrative? I'm wondering if that's what was going on in my particular household, because they didn't talk about it much at all. So everything that I learned about it was from situations like these, me asking a lot of questions. But what I had heard about it was that it was a bad thing. Also, what I learned from my parents is everybody wasn't plugged in. You think that if there's a rebellion going on and it's predominantly black, that all the black people in the city were participating in the rebellion. My mom's we went to work. My mom worked for the state of Michigan. My dad worked for General Motors. We had to go to work. So, like, thinking about, like, all the black people in the city were at the rebellion. No, not everybody was participating. Just as if there was a rebellion today, some of us, like, wouldn't be on the front lines. We might want to activate in different ways, but it's not a thing that everyone does and everyone thinks about in the same way.
Chastity, we've been talking about the 40th anniversary of 67. We had the 25th anniversary of 67. It feels or looks different this time. Are we bringing in the context that we need? Because, you know, did black people lose their collective mind, or was there something pushing this response?
I would hope that we're being more thoughtful about it because we are further away from it. You know, when something is close in your mind and it just happened, you're not totally, you don't have that 30,000-foot view because you're still a little feeling some kind of way about it, Now I feel like people are more honest about what happened. I mean, just the other day, I'm talking to someone. This is someone I would, learned from Detroit. And I said, well, okay, I have to be on this panel about the rebellion. This is a black guy. He's like, what rebellion? Because we're so used to it being called the riots. But very recently, in the past few years, more of us are starting to embrace the word rebellion because, I mean, come on, let's be real. When it's white folks, it's a rebellion. Shay's rebellion, Doors rebellion, Bacon's rebellion. But when it's, 2 summers of black folks in 100 different cities getting pissed off about getting beat up by the police, it's a riot. So I think now we're starting to, in the last few years, maybe in the last 10 since the 40th anniversary, really embrace it from a more intellectual standpoint and think about the ramifications. And, we're making comparisons between now and then and talking about solutions where I think, when the Kerner Commission came out, people were still very, very sensitive.
Peter, I want to talk about a real race riot, 1943, in this city. Tell us about that, just a brief overview.
Yeah. No, and I'd actually, for a minute, go back to 1925.
Oh, Ike was there, too.
No,
Well, let's let him explain it, and then we'll talk more.
There's a thing called the internet. And what's great is that you can get 2 documents that you never thought you could. One is the 1925 Mayor's Interracial Committee looking at the race violence that happened in 1925. The other, and you can Google it on your phone right now in the audience, is What Caused the Detroit Riot? That's the title. Right? And it's not 1967, it's 1943, and it's an amazing report that was put out by the NAACP, by Walter White, who was also in Detroit in 1925 as part of the Sweets trial, and Thurgood Marshall, who did the factual investigation to come back and tell us what caused the 1943 race riots, and it was a race riot. And what you do if you put that together and telescope that in the Kerner Commission.
Okay, so what makes it a race riot? Tell me what happened.
Well, it's in the middle of the war, right? There's competition over jobs. There's all of this sort of tension in the air. There's migration from the South, not just from blacks, but from whites. So it's not just sort of the people who grew up here, but people coming in. And our racial attitudes in 500 years has not changed, right? So all it takes is a kind of spark to set that off. But that was largely an example of white racial violence against blacks. Right? You sort of look at where the violence was being exercised, who was being hurt, where the police role was in that, very much a race riot. The thing I want to do is sort of say, what caused that? Right? We're going to peel back this onion, and what you can do is juxtapose this report from 1925, 1943, the Kerner Commission of 68, and it's the same damn thing. Right? First, police, right? The sort of aggressive, awful police action. It's the absence of opportunity in terms of employment. It's the differential segregation and treatment of schools, right? And who has a good education. It's awful housing, right? Awful housing, awful housing, awful housing. And that connects to the foreclosure crisis today. Those are the same root causes. So what you're talking about is what are the deeper structural issues? What's the sort of notion of structural racism and how that interplays? That happened in 43. And I sort of one other small thing. Judge Keith, right? When we wrote his biography, think about him in 1943. He had just graduated from West Virginia State College, a historical black school. He was off to go to a military, right, that wasn't representing and fighting for him. And his father had just died tragically, sort of weeks before the 43 riot. And his mother just pleaded for him to stay in the house. She knew how dangerous it was to go out there. And he wants to go out there. I mean, he's in a young male. He's coming into a sort of fullness. He wants to go participate, but he listens to his mother because he also knows he's the one who's heading the household, right? It's his responsibility. And then go back to 1967, he was part of the people that actually have African Americans in the decision-making process, not centrally, but certainly within that locus, where he could finally then act, right? As an adult, as a person with authority and some degree of power, to have influence over the city's decision-making that's taking place as the city is, in turmoil around him.
In some of his decisions, he doesn't pull any punches either. It's really interesting. All right, so I want to get to 1943. Where were you and what were you doing? And why'd you get in trouble? Why were white people chasing you? What'd you do?
No, yeah, that's really the truth. I was born in 1943, and my family moved because of an incident that occurred. My father worked at a place called the Southern Cotton Oil Company, and he was the spokesperson for the coloreds. And they elected him to go and speak to the white boss about getting a pay raise. I was a month old when this happened, and so my dad went to speak to this man, and how dare you have the audacity to come and talk to me about a pay raise for these people? And so he immediately put my father on the midnight shift by himself, and he told me we were going to get him. So that night, the Klan came for my father, who he always had this expression, it's better to say there he goes than there he lays. So my father took off running. He ran home, told my mother what happened. He took the Greyhound bus to Detroit, the family up to Chicago, and the family moved there. In terms of 1943, it's interesting because the true race riot that it was, and you get so many different stories. And when I first heard about this in the 50s, I remember them saying that a white person had thrown a black baby off the Belle Isle Bridge, at MacArthur Bridge. And then it was the other way with the other group of black people saying so. And so in terms of a true race riot, that's what it was. And the police sided with one side. And a great number of black people were killed. And that was never forgotten. As a young boy growing up, it was never forgotten by black people. It's very much like those people who moved up from the South thinking that things would be better here in Detroit, and they were not. They had been horribly abused by the police or the sheriffs down there, and it was not the case. Now, I tell this one story.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
the Grosse Pointe story. Because that's what I was kidding you about. What'd you do that the police shot you? What you do that people were chasing you? He told me just before an interesting story. When he told the story, he told you guys about the night of the 24th, July 24th, and being stopped.
Yeah.
Tell me what the response was.
I did a speech out in Grosse Pointe, and I hope that this gentleman listens to this presentation at some point. And I did a presentation in Grosse Pointe, and I talked about what happened to me when I was 14. And this man read the newspaper and sent me a letter to my office at the University of Detroit Mercy. And in it, he asked, what did I do to cause those police officers to beat me up? Because every police officer he's come across has always been nice to him. Now, this is absolutely true. And I would tell you, when I first read this, I couldn't believe that it was happening. So I showed it to my wife, and she's, don't respond, don't respond, don't respond. He's 80 years old, and he says he's a professor, former professor. Then I showed it to my two sons, one's 39, the other's 33, and they said, Dad, look him up and kick his ass. No. No, but you think about this in terms of a person asking, what did you do? And so my next question would be to him.
Do you have any black friends?
Well, he did. He said in the letter, he said, I have a black friend. I swear to you, I have a black friend who said that all those black people who got killed by the police, if they did what the police said, they wouldn't have got killed. And so, I mean, it incenses you even more so that someone thinks this way, but he's not going to change. But it's not just him. And throughout all these years that I've been around, you can't just imagine the things that I've seen and heard that people do. And how do we change people? Walking down the street in a community, and a young white kid is about 5 or 6 years of age, young child. He sees me walking down the street. He says, "Excuse me, Mr. Nigger, are you moving out?" You know, I mean, this is a young kid. Where does this come from? If the parents don't do or say something, obviously they didn't say something. But these are those things that we will never be able to change unless there's great dialogue with that child. But those people we won't change. Like that old man, we won't change him.
All right, your turn for questions. Lindsay's running around here with a wireless. Where are you, Lindsay? There she is. Running around with a wireless mic. You can ask one or all. What question you want? You want to start here? Tell us your name and where you're from.
Okay, thank you. Hi, my name's Tom Gary. I'm from Ohio, and I want to just say that I love Michigan radio. And Lester, I listen to you all the time, so it's nice to see you. Here's my question. If someone could address the Detroit public schools and how many students they had at one time, say back in the 60s, like say 65 or something, versus what they have now, and just how that institution has gone from then till now.
It's 300,000 back then, wasn't it?
Yeah, you had an excess of 300,000 students. Of course, this is when you had 1.5 million people in the city. So back then, it was like the neighborhoods. You had the schools that the white kids went to, the schools that the black kids went to, and that's just how it was. And then in the 70s, they had the desegregation, the busing happen, right? And it was a huge fiasco. Oakland County Executive L. Brooks Patterson. Yeah, they represented families in the suburbs who did not want black kids from Detroit being bused to their areas. And this Milliken versus Bradley went all the way to the Supreme Court. And at the time, you had Justice Thurgood Marshall say, if you don't get this case right, if you don't desegregate the schools, then your communities have no chance of being desegregated. You have no chance for equal opportunity for people if you can't get what's happening in the schools right. If you don't want your kids mixing with other 5-year-olds that don't look like yours, right? And what happened was the case went the way, that it probably shouldn't have. And essentially the Supreme Court said, you know what, it's not the suburbs' fault if black kids in the city need, better schools or desegregation. It's not up to the suburbs to help the city. Leave them out of it. Good luck. And what happened, today we have less than 50,000 kids in Detroit public schools. The achievement level is literally the worst in the country. Detroit Public Schools is achieving at a worse level than any city in the country on the national report card. Had the worst test scores in the history of the test. So there's been a lot to happen, and all of it in the wrong direction in the last 50 years.
We've got one. Where's Lindsay? Lindsay, where are you? There. She's behind the bar.
Hi, I'm Mike Shesterkin. I grew up around Detroit, and I have to say that it's just shocking to sit here as a white person and have, if it makes any difference, I apologize, you know what I mean? It's an amazing thing, but, and so that's where the question comes from that I have. I explained this to my daughter yesterday, and she said, well, maybe you feel that way because you're white, right? But I listen a lot to Chris Hedges, and he has a very cogent message about the era in which we live. And he refers to the state of governance as a plutocracy, which is government by the wealthy. And so when I look at what's going on in this age, and part of it is, and that's what I want to get at, is this idea that we live in a system that's holding down people who are poor. And there's this systemic problem around that. Because I think, at least for me, in the last few years of my life, I've come a lot further along in understanding where I came from. And so looking forward, that's the thing I want to get at, and hear sort of what you think about that in terms of the systemic nature in which we live, right? That, like, for example, I'll give you a great example, car insurance.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
That you don't have to say anything more.
Right,
We know
right.
exactly
So,
where you're at.
so the interesting thing is that politically, when it goes up to Lansing, nothing gets done. Why is that? Because I think it is governance by the wealthy.
Who wants to tackle that? Peter does. I can tell.
A couple things, so much loaded in there. How many people have heard of Bacon's Rebellion? 1, 2, 3. I mean, this whole notion of the racial bribe. Right, so Bacon's Rebellion happened long before there was a country called the United States, and it happened when everybody was coming over as indentured servants, black and white, and so had this notion, and there was no notion of blackness. Right? This whole notion of blackness is created, right, and constructed largely to divide us. Right, and in Bacon's Rebellion, there was this idea that all the people who were being oppressed by the landowning class of the British colonies came together, right, and revolted. Right? And that scared the hell out of everybody. If all the people who are being oppressed see the identity and the commonality of their oppression as the motivating theme, right, that's frightening. Right? And what happened after that was this whole division, the creation of this notion of blackness, the separation of who the indentured servants were, this notion of creating property rights, limited property rights, and therefore participatory rights in government for some of the European indentured servants, and that's that racial bribe. So all throughout history, you can ask this, no matter what century you're in, is how come this racial bribe has limited the ability to see the people, there's a lot of poor white people. Right? There's poor white people everywhere. There's more white people on welfare than there are black people on welfare. There's more white people benefiting from these programs, but they don't identify with that. So that's sort of one notion is how do we come to grips with that at a time of increasing income inequality? Right? And I think that's incredibly significant. Where do we see our commonality? Right? What creates community? What do we have an interest? And if you think about what causes broader political change, there are two things that could either be explosive or could be incredibly constructive to systematically change our society. One is increasing income inequality, right? Because that's screwing everybody. Right? The other is changing demography. If we could imagine a way to go back and look at our commonality, what we have in common interest in terms of working constructively within our democratic processes, in 15, 20 years, we could radically reorient where power is, right? What justice means, what our obligations are to our neighbors, and those are very positive possibilities. Or if we continue to buy into this racial bribe, that's just dynamite. Right? In a very negative sense of what dynamite can do.
Anybody else want to respond?
Just briefly, I want to say I don't like, yes, there are systemic forces at play, but I don't want that to absolve our personal responsibility in this. Like everybody has a role in this. We've all been programmed and we've all got work to do. So yes, that's happening, but that doesn't mean that everybody in the room, including all of us, doesn't have some work to do in this.
Yeah, I always say, white folks, talk to your cousins. Because, you know, really, this whole idea of racial attitudes and you know, racial identity and us versus them, it's no better than it was 50 years ago. You know, when we, again, the schools, that's what I'm always writing about. When we look at the schools, and they're more segregated now than they were 50 years ago, and you can have segregated schools and, you know, your community is not segregated, you know? Your community is pretty almost diverse, but you send your kids away so they can go to an all-white school or away so they can go to an all-black school, you got a problem. And nothing's going to get better. And what happens when you have segregated schools? Think of all of the dominoes that fall when you're just talking about educating children. Segregated, unequal schools is going to lead to what? Somebody's not going to get educated well, which means there's going to be income inequality. There's going to be joblessness. Joblessness now for black people in Detroit is worse now. And if you can't get a good job, you can't buy a house. Now, housing issues are worse for black people in Detroit. Housing ownership. The city is 60% renters. And in the 60s, my auntie had a house, you know. There were people, black people owned more houses then than they do now. Think of all of the dominoes that fall when you have unequal, segregated schools. We know that our schools are unequal, inadequately funded, segregated, more so now, and all those dominoes, those other dominoes are falling right into place.
You know, one of the things I hear, I've spent a fair amount of time in Lansing. One of the things I hear constantly from outstate and upstate legislators is, oh, God, no, we're not going to waste more money down that sandpit of Detroit. We're just not going to throw more money at Detroit. There's this attitude, and it's cultural. It's not factually based. It's cultural that those Democrats, those black Democrats, are just going to just go through that money and we won't get anything for it. And that's the attitude.
And so when I was police chief, I went to Lansing to testify on some things that we needed for the city of Detroit. And the reason is that we were trying to get overtime for police officers to work in certain areas. I remember this person who was part of the state government. He said to me, he said, God, Dr. McKinnon, you did a great presentation. Absolutely great. He says, but I can't vote for that. And I said, okay. I said, well, could you tell me why? He said, because if I voted for that, he said, first of all, he said, people in my community don't come to Detroit. They don't come to Detroit. He said, we might drive through on the freeway going to Ohio or something like that, but we don't come to Detroit. He said, but if I voted for that, the people would vote me out of office. So I can't vote for it. So he was putting his job above the thoughts of what people do. You know, now if we go back to, was it Chris?
A politician did that?
Chris. So Chris, I mean, let me say this. When you talked about feeling apologetic, well, it's not apologizing, but thinking the way that you do. We have a good friend sitting next from you, Dr. Danielle McGuire, who works at Wayne State and has done extensive research. We need more people to think the way that you do, the way that she does, the way that you all do in terms of how do we get along, how do we talk about these things? Because most people, when we sit down and start talking about race, as we know, I mean, there's an old song by Archie Bell and the Drill called "The Tighten Up." I mean, people tighten up. I mean, their butts tighten up, and hey, I don't hear about it, man. You know, because it's uncomfortable for me. But when you think about this in terms of, as I've said before, people who've lived this all their lives, and wherever you might go, there's always this question about you. I mean, I'm walking. At that time, the police chief of the city of Detroit, in a suit and tie, walking through a damn department store, and a damn security guy follows me around as if I'm going to steal something. Because, oh, come on now. Yeah, but that was it. And so I confronted him. I said, what the hell, what did I do? He said, you look suspicious. I said, I used to do that stuff as a young police officer. But see, the ideas and mentality that's there. Now, what happens when there's a young black man who gets pissed off and confronts this person? Said, you followed me because I look suspicious? What is suspicious to you? These are all those things that we talk about in terms of how you view people, or as a police person stops a person, or a business person talks to a person. How do you do that? These are things we got to talk about, because if we don't, it continues to be a major, major, major problem. And the people in 1967 said enough is enough. And how far does it go? How much more can people take? You know, and so please, thank you for what you said. But I think that all of us who are here today who are trying to learn something, it's important for all of us to continue to do so. Otherwise, we have serious problems.
Otherwise, 50 years from now, we're going to be having the same conversation.
I'll be here too. I'll be the oldest one there too. God, 50, oh God. I can see Al Roker on the Today Show. And there's Ike McKinnon, 124 years old.
I'm waiting for that show. I want to see that show. I do. All right, do we have another question? Yeah, here, Lindsay, there's one right in the front row.
Yes, thank you for all this vital, enriching time. I wanted to ask this question.
Hang on, tell us your name and where you're from.
Oh, sorry. I'm Johnny Metlock, and I live in Detroit, but grew up in Texas. I read a friend sent an article, and it was quite incisive, and the writer just wrote very directly and candidly about kind of attacking a lot of the words we use or showing their insufficiency, like whether that's white privilege or inclusiveness or these various terms we're a little bit more used to. But she or he said the main thing that needs to be used and talked about is white fragility. So it was a pretty.
I read that article. Yes, I think the tone of the article was such that all of these words have been created so that white people feel more comfortable talking about race.
Yeah. So would
Yeah.
comment?
Here is my thing. If you have the capacity for empathy, if you can listen to like the stories that Ike told, and those are just some of the stories, and understand that all people of color have a lifetime of experiences like that. Like, if you can feel uncomfortable in one conversation, I think you can do that. Like, given the fact that collectively we've had millions of negative experiences like that. Like, I haven't been shot at, but I got pulled over in Livonia for no reason. Probably for driving with my white boyfriend. I don't think they like that.
Shame on you!
Shame. Been followed around numerous stores. Got pulled over for a traffic violation, and the cop on my passenger side had the gun out of the holster. I'm like, really? It's a stop sign.
As
But
if
these
driving
kind of
white
things-
black wasn't.
Yes,
Yeah.
we all have like a lifetime of these kinds of experiences. So if you can recognize that we've had to do that, can you have a tough conversation? Like, seriously, it's so small in comparison to what we have to experience like every day. And the fact that you can experience all that and like joke about it and not just be like the angriest man walking the earth, like, you need an award for that. But we all do. We all do.
But let me tell you why. There's multiple reasons, but primarily, my father was this tremendously strong and proud person who said, their son, he said, there are good and bad people in every race. I want you to understand that. And so when I was 14 years old, before I was beat up by the police, we went to my grandmother's funeral in Alabama, and we were driving back from the funeral, my father, my brother, and I. And as we were driving through Birmingham, Alabama, these 6 young white men started throwing bricks and bottles at a car. And so my father's trying to outrun them as they're doing this. And we literally came to a fork in the road. And they went one way as we turned right and went that way. And so my dad stopped in this Shell gas station. It was about 1:30 in the morning to get gas. As he did so, this car came back, and these 6 guys came out with baseball bats and chains and stuff. And the name calling, and we're going to kill you, they said. At that point, there were 4 white soldiers walked out of the Shell gas station. And they said, what are you guys doing? We're going to kill these niggas, you know? And these guys said, no, you aren't. No, you aren't. Now, you think about this. This is Alabama in 1957. They said, if you fight them, we're going to fight with them. And I went, whoa. And so they called them names and everything, and they took off. And so my father thanked these young soldiers. And as we drove off, my father said, see, son, what did I tell you? What did I tell you? There's good and bad in every race, and what you saw there was good people. It doesn't matter of race. The second part of that, without monopolizing time, I had this great conversation with Nelson Mandela in 1991.
Of course you did.
What can I say, you know? I mean,
This guy's met everybody. But you tell every story you have, and we'll listen.
I'm
We will.
telling you, so he was at the Renaissance Center. When he first was released from prison, he came to Detroit. And I was assigned from the Renaissance to being with him. And I asked him, I said, Mr. Mandela, why or are you angry at the people in South Africa for what they did to you, imprisoning you for 27 years? He said to me, imagine Nelson Mandela's accent. He said, young man, why did you want to become a police officer? And I told him, about being beaten up. He said, that is a tremendous story. You must tell that story. You must tell that story. I said, yes, sir, Mr. Mandela. I said, but I want to know more about you. And he said this. He said, I am angry about what happened to me in South Africa, in my heart. But in my head, I know that I cannot show anger and want to hurt the people, because if I did, blood would run through the streets of South Africa. He said, you have to understand that. And so those two things are very important to me in terms of what my father said and what Nelson Mandela said. So I'm not trying to equate myself to Nelson Mandela, but so, you know.
But to talk to the anger point, I feel like at some point we all have to have those really honest conversations with amongst ourselves and our own families and everything, because not everybody's going to be as kind as you. People will be angry, and if you don't try and change your racial attitudes and even recognize them, then we're going to have this conversation 10 years from now, 25 years, not 50 years from now. And if you can't do it because it's the right thing to do it because you don't want your child or your children's children in the middle of the next rebellion, because it's not going to be in Detroit. Ferguson was not in St. Louis. It was in a suburb. These rebellions or uprisings are not, they don't have, borders. Ferguson, again, was a suburb. Okay, yeah, Baltimore lit up, but, it's the rebellion will not be contained.
If I could just talk about white fragility and come up with this, and I'm as guilty as anybody else, if you can't talk about this at home, right? If this can't be a conversation at the Thanksgiving Day table, then you're just making yourself feel good tonight, right? We all have to challenge ourselves and cross the family boundaries, right? It's not the conversations we're unwilling to have with strangers that really are important. It's the conversations we're not willing to have with family.
It's interesting you say that, because our students, and I know my students, they will talk to me and they say, oh, Dr. McKinnon, I never knew that. They didn't know about certain things that occurred. And when I tell them about things that's happened not only in the city of Detroit, but throughout the country, they say, well, they didn't tell me that in school, or my parents didn't tell me that. That's kind of a frightening thing. But the reality is that people are not talking about it at all. So if you don't talk to your kids about it, I have a 39-year-old son and a 33-year-old son. My 39-year-old son lives in the Bay Area of California. And he called me one day and he said, Dad, let me tell you what happened to me. And I said, what happened? He said, I went to visit my friend who's white in this community. As I drove up to his house and got out of my car, some young white guys drove by and said, nigga, go home. He said, Dad, I thought about that, and I think about all the things that you've gone through. This is the first time it ever happened to him. He said, Dad, I handled it the right way. I said, oh, you threw a brick at the car? He said, I said, because that's what I did the first time. No. He said, no, Dad. He said, I got the license plate number and I called the police department and let them know. I said, that was very slick, Jeff, But honestly, we were talking here, but these are examples of things that we all have gone through. But you've got to think about this in terms of how you talk to people about this and how do we remedy this? We're not going to solve all the problems, but we can hopefully do something about it.
Another question? Yes, sir.
First of all, I want to recognize
Can I ask your
two
name?
black women. My name is Blair Anderson, Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party.
Oh, thank you.
I'm definitely a child of that period. And the first thing I want to do is recognize the two black women standing there. You have a tremendous task ahead of you, and we are confident that you will handle that is yours. Then I want to recognize Ike McKinnon. I was a victim of a police shooting in Chicago, December 4th, 1969, the murder of Fred Hampton. Mm-hmm. And the first official affiliate of a law enforcement agency that recognized this as a murder was the Black Policemen's Union, which was one of the most radical in the country. And I remember you. So I wanted to recognize the importance of your role. Though we might have had a shootout in 1969, in 2000, I just want to recognize that and honor with, the trauma that you have had to face and witnessing and knowing so much about what our people have been through. The second part is that rebellion I've been in several rebellions, 43 years of 36 years a political prisoner. I've been in many rebellions, and I had a riotous time. Okay? So let's not negate riot, okay? Angry black folks don't necessarily have a political analysis to recognize angry people, and that doesn't negate that they are rebelling against the status quo. I made too many notes.
Let me say, there was a police officer, who was a Chicago police officer, who was black, who spoke out against the brutality that was occurring in that time that you're talking about.
Yes.
And they put him on a one-block beat in an alley. Mm-hmm. That was the punishment that he had. That was his job, to go and walk a beat in an alley, I think a block or two from police headquarters.
Yes.
And he was part of the Black Police Officers Association who talked about this. So these were the kinds of things that happened in terms of, if you spoke out, this is what happened to you. So the blue flu, the brown flu, the sheriffs and so forth, if you spoke out against it, there was a possibility this would occur with you, or you'd get fired.
The question that comes to my mind is 1967. Here we are, these 50 years later, and black folks more terrified in America than ever. I won't say whenever, but terrified. Black men, terrified for your sons, terrified for your sons, your daughters. What is the political analysis that takes us into the future in terms of law enforcement? What do you say to cops?
Me? Well, let me tell you this. I've been around forever with this because I'm old, you know. But because he pointed it out. The reality is this. We have to do certainly a much better job in the selection of people who are involved in law enforcement. There is no question. Number two, we have to continue to do a periodic check of those people who are involved in law enforcement. Because we do a screening of people who join the department, but after a year or so, they are still on and can do things and not be checked with it. The other part of this, too, is understand that there's something that's called the Law Enforcement Code of Ethics. You can go look it up. The first paragraph of that Law Enforcement Code of Ethics is, as a law enforcement officer, my fundamental duty is to serve the community, to safeguard lives and property, protect the innocent against deception, the weak against oppression or intimidation, and respect the constitutional rights of all to liberty, equality, and justice. And then they talk about a number of things, keeping private life unsullied and on and on. But if we just think about this, if every law enforcement officer abided by that, even that first paragraph of the Law Enforcement Code of Ethics or Conduct, we wouldn't have the problems that we have right now. But however, our recruitment process, and when you bring a person on who might have some tendencies towards racial bias or gender bias or whatever it might be, that leads to more problems. I do a lot of diversity training. And one of the places I went to was predominantly white. I had a staff of 2 blacks and 2 whites training. And at this one place, this police officer showed up with a swastika on his left arm. And I looked, and nobody said anything. So I went to the person who's in charge of the department, and I said, I'll let you know now. I'm telling you this because if something happens in which this person is involved, I'm going to testify for the other side. He said, what did you see? I said, excuse me. I said, there's a fucking swastika on his arm. Oh, I didn't see that. I said, come on, bullshit. Everybody's seen it, but look at this. This is your department. And if you let this go, well, you know, he's got, he's what's it, the term they use? He's strange. You're damn right he's strange. He should not be on your department. But you think about this in terms of attitude. Now, I get very upset about my wife. She said, I can read your face now. Well, hell, if somebody shot at you a number of times, you'd have these attitudes too. But we've got to do, again, a better job of selecting and making sure we continue that process as long as they stay law enforcement officers and able to take somebody's life.
The training needs to change. Yeah.
Certainly. If I,
Can I say one thing real quickly? I'm not a panelist, but you struck a chord with me because you talked about riots, right? And I hear and see in comments of news stories in the suburban papers around here this comment about those black people, if they were really trying to protest, why did they loot? During the Depression, in many white, all-white towns, when there was a disaster, whether it was weather or fire or anything else, white people took advantage of that moment and looted the stores. This is not unique to black people. This is unique to people who are in such dire straits that they have to take advantage of every opportunity they have.
Let me confirm something for you with that. So I was in Baltimore during their uprising, and I was watching people come out of that CVS store with diapers, bottles of water, food. It was necessities. That's all people wanted, was things that they need that they didn't have access to.
yeah. I'm just going to say that the key word of Baba Blair's comment was, what's our political analysis, right? And that's betraying your training. And I say you've got production staff from Michigan Radio. If you don't get his name in contact, he has stories to tell, important, significant stories, and his daughter has even better stories. I don't want to, betray that. But that political analysis, what is that, right? And the stuff you've shared with me at different times, somebody who goes from this notion of embracing violence and resistance, and I think we have to embrace Black Power, right? We can't be afraid of trying to understand the movement for Black Power and what that means today, right? But kind of the evolution as well of somebody who, as a youth, was exposed to that theory, and yet now, as an older adult, has just amazing understanding of what's going on and an amazing ability to teach us. So I just sort of raised that up as well.
So, questions. Let's. Oh,
You're back here, Lester.
where are you? Oh,
Over here,
way in the
back.
back. Somebody in the back finally got a question. You should come over on me. We'll get you.
My name is Emily Hall. My family's been in Detroit for over 100 years.
Emily, a year older than me, huh?
No, I said my family, not me. But I wanted to address the issue of education, because education in schools are so tied to housing. Okay? We know this because whenever you isolate a people, then, especially us, then we get less services, we get less everything. The idea, but that doesn't start with just the schools going bad. It started back in 1945 when the Housing Act was passed. How many of you understand how the suburbs, up until a few years ago, were almost purely white? How many of you know why? Because the federal government set out the standards for racism in housing. My father, who could afford a house, could not get a mortgage back in 1956 because of the Housing Act. And that's how the suburbs got lily white, because black people were not a part of the Housing Act. And when you can't get the housing, you don't get into the schools, you don't have the environment. That's what we have to address. You cannot change the future until you understand how we got here. You got to understand how it got here. And, when we talk about wealth, and I don't want to get excited, but I hear this all the time about how poor black people are. Nobody ever talks about how much wealth was stolen from black people. Tulsa, Oklahoma, Florida.
Black Bottom.
Black Bottom? St. Louis. I mean, towns were torn up. Towns that had been going well were destroyed by white people because they were jealous of the wealth that the towns had had built. Talk about that wealth when you talk about the failure of black people to have wealth. You got to talk about that. You got to talk about you got to know where we came, how we got to where we're going to before we change anything. That's all I know.
So one of the things that is really clear for most middle class and low income folks, the way families build wealth is through housing, homeowning. And so if you're white and you went to the suburbs, your wealth increased because of your home investment. If you're black and you stayed in Detroit, you watched your housing value plummet and you had nothing to give your kids. You know more about this than probably anybody else up here. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, first, you said it all. I can't add anything more to what you said, so I just really, applaud your analysis. It all is about wealth, right? This is America. And I talk to my students, and I also want to sort of raise up institutions that need change. Wayne State needs change, right? The law school has such a small percentage of African-American students in the entering class, it's shameful, right? So I'm getting all my students from the Tri-County area, sort of these white suburbanites. You try to start working with them. How do you tell this? But you sort of ask them, so, well, what's the wealth differential, average wealth differentials between a black family and a white family in America, right? Right? All right, we got some smart people. People, maybe it's 2 times more or 3 times more. It's like a bidding auction, and it goes up to 10 to 13 times difference, right? And that should hit you in the stomach, right? And then you can say, if you look at the average increase in black wealth for the last 30 years, and you project that into the future, it would take 228 more years, right? 228 more years, almost the length of time that we had slavery in this country, for the black family to have the same amount of average wealth as the white family today, right? And then imagine, if you understand compounding interest, how far ahead the white family will be in 238 years, right? And it all comes down to housing. You tell this all story about segregation and housing, right? And that defines the area. That tells us why we have the spatial racism I said before. And if we don't attack it at a regional level, we're not making any change. And it's getting worse. Housing in Detroit is getting worse. There's upward spirals, there's downward spirals, right? So if you look at the trend lines, things are worse today on housing than they were 50 years ago. Right? But there's another story that starts to connect this notion of how we get these conversations going. What I would suggest is that every white family here go back to Thanksgiving and go back 3 generations and say, how did you get your home? Right? When did you move? How did you finance it? And if you can tell it within this historical context of racialized access to home financing, you can start conversations at a structural level that otherwise couldn't be started. And I think that would be a wonderful experiment for everybody here and other folks to take home around the housing story and then the notion of privilege and what that means today, how much that made a difference in your family's life because 3 generations ago, your grandparents were able to get a home.
We are here, I assume, we understand or try to understand. How do we get this message to people who are out there who say, I don't give a damn about them? And that's frightening for me, my parents bought a house in 1959 near the University of Detroit Mercy. I got a copy of the deed, and the deed said, no colored person could buy this house but you're 1999 or something like that. I was just amazed that restricted covenants was there, But how do we get people to understand this? I mean, obviously people here won't understand, but how do we get other people to understand that there's some crazy things that went on and are going on right now? And even though we're out trying to educate, that there are people who are still doing this.
Yeah, actually, the Fair Housing Coalition, I have folks that I talk to on a regular basis, and they will tell you they're still redlining. You know what redlining is? Everybody knows what that is. There's still redlining going on today. It's just a lot less formal. And it's not, it's based on race, it's based on gender, it's based on gender orientation, it's all those things, and we're still dealing with it. We haven't dealt with it well. Class, yes, actually, that's very true. You got a question?
Yeah.
Come on in.
Thank you. Well, I got it. I want to thank the panel for coming out tonight and speaking to everybody. My name is Ronald Norwood. I'm a native of Detroit. I graduated from Alabama A&M University with a 4 at the U of M and Wayne State. But I came up here tonight, you know, I mean, not only to ask a question, but also to address what I think the crowd has also been having on their mind, which is we all are pretty smart people. I'm pretty sure that's why we came out tonight, in terms of we're at least understanding of what the issues are or how we want to proceed to change those things. But how can we be proactive in the long term, or from this point on, going forward to make real change, right? We spoke about a lot of situations. I had the pleasure of being in the Broad High School Scholars Program at MSU, where we studied the 1967 riots and 1943 riots extensively, correct? And so I think what a lot of people, and not only myself, would like to come away with tonight is, how can we be more proactive? How can we get more involved? We know about a lot of these issues where, you know, I mean, we're aware of what's going on from Fidel Castro in Minnesota, who didn't have any representation from the NRA, who's supposed to be advocates of gun rights or whatever the case may be. But I also want to, you know, I mean, focus on how can we be more involved, not just as white liberal or white conservative Americans, but also as an African American who was born and raised from Detroit. And so I think that's an important question that we need to focus on tonight, or at least a topic that we need to focus on, so that we can at least advance together to try to come up with some real solutions. Because me personally, you spoke of Detroit Public Schools being the worst school districts. You're speaking of 2009, correct?
2009, 2011, 2013,
From then on,
2015.
right. Area code 48205, Osborne High School.
Oh, absolutely.
Which was the most
murder
dangerous
capital.
zip code in America at that time. And so I graduated from Osborne in 09 as class president, student council president. And so I have a lot of personal experiences I can speak to, not as much as you, sir, but...
That's because you're not as old.
Exactly. And that's the whole point. But I can say that I know exactly what you're talking about when you speak of these things. And so, at least for me, I would like to know, what are some ways that we can be more proactive? Because we know these stories. We know how bad it was. We know how, you know, I mean, tragic it was, and whatever the case may be. But I think, for me, what would bring, as you said, us young males who are growing up in 2016, 17, 18, what would bring me a little bit more relief is, what are the solutions to these issues, right?
Got it.
So appreciate it.
So
Thank you.
that was wonderful. If you have a chance, I would say you got to see the documentary that the Free Press and Bridge magazine did called 12th and Claremont about.
Oh, it's really good. It's really good. You should see it. Yes.
Yeah, it's and it's going to be on Channel 7 sometime, I think, this month.
This weekend, next weekend.
12th and Claremont. Check it out. It's about the '67 uprising, and it's only like an hour and some change. It's really, really good. One thing, I've seen it twice now. One thing that sticks out that I remember every time I see it, I'm like, wow. There was a home video, it was audio actually, from interviews from people back then. And they interviewed a white family who moved out of the city after all the commotion. And the man said, family moved, this is a white guy, our family moved. And I was basically told that, you know, we got to go because the black people are mad. And I was being taught that I was supposed to be afraid of these people, but I don't know why. I don't know why I was supposed to be afraid of them. And when I think of solutions, I think, you know, if we could all just be real honest with yourself. Are you afraid of black people? Why? Is it a cultural, almost training? Because if all of us live in segregated societies, you don't even know that many black people. What you scared of? Really, what you scared of? Is it something that you're being trained since a little child to be afraid of people just because of their race? We need that. That's a very basic conversation you can have with yourself and your family, and ask yourself, is that right? Really, the black people put your people in chains and bring you over here. The black people put the KKK on you. Did they put Jim Crow on you? Did they segregate your schools? Did they cheat your kids out of an education? Did they convict your families 3 times the rate for the same crimes and imprison your people? What do black people do to you, and why are you afraid?
Lauren, I really want to hear your thoughts. I really do.
So many things. I feel I get asked all the time because people know I do these facilitations. Like, Lauren, what can we do? everybody's role can't be to plug into the movement. And sometimes I think that absolves us from personal responsibility, like showing up, like even to be on the front lines in some march and then going home and not addressing your racist uncle at the coffee table, like, is counterintuitive. I feel like it's too easy for people to say, well, you know, I went to the airport when they were having that thing with all the immigrants. Well, good for you. Like, did you have a conversation with that person who you could actually influence, that cares about you and listens to you, to really make a difference? So it's really easy to be like, racism's out there. No, it's in here. Everybody, it's in here. Like, all the workshops I do about racism cause people to do some self-reflection. I don't point at people and say, see, you're racist. Like, I present some information, people share some stories, and then through self-reflection, they're like, holy shit, I might be holding on to some racial bias. That's the only way you get people to, like, change. You can't tell people you're racist, you're bad. You have to walk people through a self-reflective process where they can say, am I holding on to some biases that might be harming some people? Like, we're dying as a result of this. Like, black people are getting killed. The time, it's like critical for us right now that white people start to do something about racial issues. But it's like everybody. It's not the activist. It's not like the civil rights lawyer. It's like every human being. Like, maybe naively, I believe that systems are people and people can change. Like, I've seen through these workshops, like, people change in front of my face. So usually I do it with cohorts of fellowships or like employees at an organization. So they're people that already have a relationship with each other and care about each other. But I have seen when like the black guy in the group tells a story about how he's been pulled over numerous times and his white friends are like, wow, that happens to you? And the comments are always like, but you're so professional. You're so nice. And just to have that white person understand that you can't earn your way out of racism, you can't dress your way out of racism, you can't achieve your way out of racism. For the people for whom your race is a problem, like the only thing that matters is that you have black skin. So no matter what else you've got going on in your life, just the fact that you have black skin makes you feel a threat. And I have seen like that aha moment in front of my face, so I know that it can happen. So I'm hopeful, which is why I keep doing these things. But like everybody has to take some personal responsibility. Every single individual has to do something.
Check yourself.
Something, anything.
Peter?
Yeah, just...
I just told, by the way, this is the last, we got to finish up because we're out of time, but
be pretty quick.
please.
You can't do it only as an individual, right? This is what Baba Blair was talking about, a political analysis. If we don't understand the way that structural racism is functioning in our country from a historical perspective and how it impacts today, we're all just kind of like little atoms kind of running around trying to do the right thing. So it really is this notion, we got to educate ourselves. We got to understand the way that structural racism is mapping out and playing out in our city, in our region, because if we don't do that, we don't have a guiding principle, and we need a guiding principle to do that. And there's one other sort of mantra we use at the Key Center, which I call the 3 R's, which is race, regionalism, and reconciliation. And we got to sort of put those things together and think about what's the role of race in any issue, education, police, housing, what's the role of regionalism, and how does it get mapped out on a regional level, and how do we start planting the seeds of reconciliation, which may be a multi-generational process. And that's at least one way to try to think about some of the things we might do in terms of changing our thinking about how we act.
Ike, you get the last word. Everybody said amen, right?
My sons, they say, Dad, you know, you're becoming more radical the older you get. I said, no, I've always spoke this way, but I was never the police chief, the deputy mayor, and professor. And now people tend to think that I know what I'm talking about. Let me say this to you. You all are here because you are part of trying to learn. If we can leave here today and each and every one of you say, I'm going to speak out, speak up for any kind of equality that there might exist. If someone says something bad about whomever it might be, or if someone doesn't know something, I'm going to try and educate them. If we become the emissaries for truth and use the term justice, we become the emissaries. If we can do this, we can all feel that we've tried to make a difference. You know, Dr. King, and everybody quotes him. See, listen, see, they're upset.
Did you hear that? She asked him, did you meet him too?
I happened to meet 6 presidents of the United States. Nelson Mandela, Bishop Tutu, and keep going on and on. So anyway, look, Dr. King, he was with this very wealthy person. And the guy said to Dr. King, I want to change the world. And Dr. King said, man, you got all the money in the world. You can do that. So this guy set out to change the world with all of his money. And within a few months, I guess, he came back to Dr. King and he said, man, there's too many bad things happening and too many people. I can't change the world. He said, I'm going to try and change the state of Illinois, where he lived. And they talked. I guess a few months later, he came back and he said, man, Illinois is hell. It's hard to change, too. But it led down to him and Dr. King speaking. And Dr. King said, maybe you should change you. And look, I'm not asking you to change you, but I'm asking you to speak about whatever there might be. I've done this for a long time. You don't know that I said to someone, I was shot at 8 times, I was stabbed twice, and I survived through that, including being in that damn war in Vietnam. But it made me a better person in terms of human inequality and why people do crazy-ass things. And so at my age of 74, I'm going to continue to try and speak out and do as much as I can. And that's what I asked you to do. Don't wait. Do it now. Do it now. Right now. Because you want to have a better world for yourself, for your children, and certainly for your grandchildren. If you don't, it's going to continue. And that's what I leave you with. Thank you.
That's Dr. Isaiah McKinnon. Go on Amazon, look up his name, buy his books. That's Lauren Hood. She's with Live 6. She's making a big change in her neighborhood. We're going to look forward to see what happens there. That's going to be interesting. If you don't know Bridge Magazine, you really should know Bridge Magazine. That's Chastity Pratt Dawsey. She writes for it, and she concentrates on education. And she's also a co-author of The Intersection, which is also available on Amazon. And Dr. Peter Hammer, professor of law at Wayne State University, and also an author, so you got to look him up on Amazon as well. You're going to run out of money now. I want to thank you all.
No.
What?
The young man made a request.
Oh, I guess.
We haven't fully honored that. I think I can help him with that. Want to defeat, want to battle gentrification? Invest through the community organizations that exist. Invest. Buy properties in partnership with the Community Development Corporation, with the block clubs. Buy property, help us hold on, or else Detroit will look just like this room.
That's it.
In a few more years. Yep. And that should be very threatening. Invest. Buy homes in partnership with the community. Take a direct action. Fuck the bullshit.
And now we know he's an activist. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you all for coming out. I really appreciate it. And please keep listening to Michigan Radio and follow these folks. They're great.